Hello everyone, my name is Hadil and today we're going to create secret messages in processing. To continue what I started with the mini-series last tutorial relating to importing elements into processing. So today we're going to talk about importing SVGs into our designs. The main concept of this is that whatever text I input into my sketch, I'm going to get out as a design. So I already created the glyphs, but I'm going to insert the clip where I created it in Illustrator before we start coding.
From my winter hell, I've got candles and candy. I can be your daddy if you only let me creep into your prison cell. Hey baby, can you tell I'm not a criminal? Your choice is seminal. I want you to stay true to what's right for you. No matter who or know what will others say.
Now after I've created everything in Illustrator, I saved them as SVGs and I've renamed every file into its equivalent letter and punctuation. So I have 26 letters naturally and 6 punctuations. So I added a comma, a dot, a space, quotes, exclamation, and question mark. And I already have my sketch file ready with the colors and I've used the background colors for the background. Now to import my SVGs, I'm going to need a PShape array and I'm going to call it glyphs. And in that, we're going to load all of the shapes that we have for the alphabet and for the punctuations. Let's create that PShape and I'm going to call them glyphs. And it'll be an array with a specific count that we're going to create right now. I'm going to call it glyph count. And for now, it's not going to have any value because I'm going to grab the values from the length of my string, which is going to be the letters or the alphabet, and then my string array, which is going to be my punctuations. So for the first one, I'm going to create a string that I'm going to call letters. And this is going to be just a simple string. So we don't need to create an array for this. And also, you're not going to need a string if you are going to grab the letter by typing. So if a key is pressed, then whatever letter that is, you're going to grab it from the glyphs array. But for this tutorial, I'm going to grab it from an initialized string. And then for my punctuations, I'm going to just call it punc for short, and it's going to be the names of those punctuations because that's how I name them for my SVGs. So the first one I'm just gonna call comma. Just know that the order of this is going to matter when you import them into the glyphs PShape array, but right now it's not gonna matter, so you don't have to order them in any kind of way. So I'm going to just write them as I remember them. So I know I have 6. One is a comma, another is a dot, and then I also have a space. I have quotes. And exclamation and question mark. Now the length of this is going to be letters, dot length, plus punctuations, dot length. And the length of a string is actually a method, not a property. If you're familiar with importing images, then this is very similar. However, because we have an array of P-shapes, then we're going to do that inside of a loop. So I'll just initialize a normal loop. The only difference here is that I'm not going to loop through the whole glyphs array because there is a little bit of a difference when it comes to importing the letters and the punctuations. So I'm going to subtract the length of this from my glyphs array, because this is only going to import or load the shapes for the letters, since the approach is going to be a little bit different. For this one, it's going to be glyph set I equals load shape, and then the name of the letter plus .svg. So I have the SVG over here, but we're gonna grab the letters from here. And the way you can do it is by calling the letters string and then using char at the position over here. So we're looping 26 times to grab every letter, and then we're loading the shapes that are associated with that letter. And then I'm going to disable the styles for the SVG, and the reason why I do this is because whatever styles you initialized in Illustrator, so for me it's all black with no stroke, that is going to show when you load the shapes. However, if you disable the styles, then the default colors for your sketch is going to be applied to the shapes. So for now, because the default is a stroke of black and a fill of white, they're going to have that color. And now we have 26 letters loaded. For the second one, we're going to grab the same thing, but this time we're going to start from 26 because we already have the 0 to 25 filled out in the array. And then I'm going to go up to the end of the glyphs.length. So I'm going to just remove this one, and I'll assign them to load shape, and the same goes over here, so .svg, because that's the format of our file. And for this part of the file name, it's going to grab whatever I have in my punk array. And because I'm looping from 26 to the end of the glyphs.length, which is going to be 31, this is not going to work because I need it to be from 0 to 6, or from 0 to 5 rather, because I have 6. So I'll just initialize a new variable over here that I'm going to call j, and then I'll increment it in here so I can use it. And I'll do the same to disable the styles for these as well. And you can test that we've loaded the shapes either by printing the array. This didn't work because I forgot to add my SVGs into my data folder. So I'll copy that and come back. Now I have all of my files, so I can go back over here and run this. And you can see that they're all loaded. And now if you want to show one of the shapes just to make sure, you can just use the shape method. And we'll grab the first one. I'll put it in the center. And I'll give it a width and a height of 100. And the reason why it's not in the center, because shape mode is corner and not center. So if I just change that to center, it should be centered. We won't be needing any of these anyway, because we'll be creating something similar to a grid. However, we're not going to create it using a grid. Instead, what I'm going to do is offset each of the glyphs until I reach the width of the canvas, and then I will go down by one cell, or by the height of my shapes. First, I'm going to need a string that I will substitute its characters with whatever glyphs I created. I'll just call it T, and naturally I'll start with hello world. To view this text now as the glyphs, we're going to create another for loop, but this time we're going to go through the characters in here. And because we have our letters all as lowercase, then I'm going to need to convert my text into lowercase before I start. So I'll just do t equals t dot to lowercase. And inside this loop, we're going to grab each of the characters. So I'm going to initialize another variable that I'm going to call letter. And this is going to be of type character. And it's going to grab each of the letters using the char at the index. So on each iteration, we're going to get one of the letters in that string. Now what this is going to do is look at each of the characters and then see if there are any of the characters that we have inside of our glyphs. So we have 6 punctuations and then we also have 26 letters. For the punctuations, we're going to use either an if statement or a switch statement to grab or to check each of the letters against our glyphs. So for the first one, let's say if I'm going to switch the letter, and let's say the first case is going to be the comma, because that's our first punctuation inside of my array over here. And I'm leaving the letters to the end because we're not going to do A, B, C for all of the 26 letters as cases. We're going to do something else for them. But for the 6 punctuations, we're going to create a case for each. So for the first one, let's say a case, or in case it was a comma, that letter was a comma inside of my string that I chose to change into glyphs, then I'm going to draw the shape associated with that comma. That is going to be glyphs at position 26, because I know my letters end at position 25 and my punctuations will start at 26 and the comma is the first one after the letter Z. So that will be 26. That's why I said you should memorize or remember the order. Just go back to it and do it in order because it's an array. If you are going to create a variable for each of these, then you just use that over here. You don't need to put all of them inside of a glyphs array, but I like it this way. And then that shape will have a position and a size. So for the position, I'm going to use X and Y, and then for the size, I'm going to just use a cell width. You can call it tile width or anything that you like. And then we'll initialize those inside of our array. For cell width or for the size, I'm going to start with an arbitrary value and I will do 100. And let's put it actually outside of the loop because we don't need to reinitialize it every time. Or let's actually define it on top over here and then just initialize it over here. So I gave it a value of 100 and then over here I'm going to do X and Y. So this is going to resemble a grid, but how we're going to do it is going the width of the canvas, and once we reach the width, or as soon as the characters exceed the width of the canvas, then we're going to go down by 1 cell. And that is when the Y is going to be offset. So for the X, we're going to start with a margin because I want a little bit of breathing room around my glyphs. So I'll start with a margin for both X and Y. And we'll initialize it over here. Actually, let's make it a float. And then I'll make it 50 pixels. And then I'll also initialize an X offset and a Y offset because that is going to offset my X and Y. So I'll add X offset to the X and Y offset to the Y. When we're starting out, X offset and Y offset are going to be 0, but then we want to increment them by the cell width. At first, we're not going to increment the Y, we're just going to increment the X offset. And the X offset is going to increment by the cell width because that is going to be, or the cell width is going to be the size of my glyphs or the size of my shapes. So every time I draw one of the characters, I'm going to add to it the cell width. So for the first one, it's going to be at margin plus 0, so that is margin. For the second one, it's going to be margin plus the cell width. So that will push it by 1 glyph. And then for the one after it, it's going to increment by another cell width. So that's kind of like cell width multiplied by 2. And every iteration, it's going to add to the X offset. But once it exceeds the width of the canvas, I want it to offset by the Y and reset the X offset to go back to the margin. And I can easily do this by using an if conditional, and the if conditional is going to check if X offset is greater or equal to the width minus margin multiplied by 2. So basically the new width that I've created by negating the margins from it. Then I want to increment the Y offset by cell height, and I want to reset my X offset. I didn't create a cell height, so it's just going to be a cell width because I want it all to be squares. Mainly because my glyphs are actually squares. If I run this, nothing is going to appear because I only have one case over here in case there was a comma, but I don't really have a comma in here. So if I added a comma, then it should appear. So let's continue with the rest of the cases. First, I'll break this case, and then I'll copy and paste it 5 more times. And by hitting Command T, you're auto-formatting it. The second one is going to be a dot. The third one, I think, is, okay, space. So a space is just going to be a space. And then quotation marks. And for this one, it's going to be an exclamation point. And for this one, it's going to be a question mark. And I have to change these to match the indices of the actual glyphs. And then if I run it, because I have one space and one exclamation point, I'm gonna have 2 glyphs already. Lastly, we'll be creating the default state for these rules. The default is going to be the other letters. Now, because our other letters are inside of a string, we can loop through this one and then check if our letter is any of these. Once it finds it, then just break out of the loop and get the shape. Since I'm already using this as a local variable, I cannot use it inside of my loop. So I'm going to define j up here and then initialize it here and increment it over here. Now I can use j inside of my loop. You can also change this to L or S or whatever you want. And then I'll be checking if letter, which is what I have here, is equal to letters char at j. If it finds it, then I need to use the shape at glyphs with j, because we have the same order for these letters inside of our string and inside of my glyphs array. That's why I started with glyphs over here when I loaded the shapes, because I wanted them to have the same positions as these over here. And those will also have an X and Y position, the same one, and then the cell width or the size for the shape. And after, I'm going to break from the loop so we don't go over and over again. If the letter, let's say the letter is A, then there's no need for this to loop through all of the letters inside of my letters string. And I made a mistake of doing it greater than letters.length. And finally, we have the shapes. The reason why some of the circles have glitchy strokes or borders is because we disabled the styles over here. So if I remove these, then we're gonna see the original style. But because I wanna color it myself, then I'm going to disable the styles, the original styles, and then I can do a fill over here. I'm going to choose a random color from the colors array that I initialized beforehand. So I'm going to get a random index, and because random gives us a float, I'm going to have to cast it into an integer so I can put it inside of the brackets or the square brackets for the colors array to grab a random number. And I'm going to do the same for stroke. This will give us a different stroke from the fill if they don't get the same random color. Now if I run this, we should get different colors. If I change the text right now to something longer, then we're going to have an issue because we have a fixed cell width. So in order to fix this, I'm going to create a count based on the number of characters I have inside of my string. So let's make this longer and let's see what kind of issue we run into. If I run this right now, it's gonna go beyond the height of my canvas. So to fix this, I'll have to create a cell width that is more dynamic. And the way I can do this is just similar to how I would create cells inside of a grid. And that would be width minus margin, because I do have margins. If you don't have margins, then just do width divided by a count. But for me, I'm going to first subtract the 2 margins from the width to create a new width, and then I'm going to divide it by a count. And count can be any number you want. So if you want it to be a fixed number, then just divide whatever or how many you have these by this count to fit into your canvas. But I think that is a little bit tedious to do every time you want to change the text. So the way I've done it is by grabbing the length of this text and getting the square root of it. Assuming that the canvas is going to be a square and all of my shapes are squares, this is going to work because the square root of an area is going to give me the number of columns or the number of rows. And because square root is going to give us a float, we're going to have to convert it into an integer. And I do that by rounding it up using ceil. Now cell width is going to be dependent on whatever the length of my text is going to be. And now it's fixed. So whatever text I have in here, it's going to calculate the count based on it, and then it'll count the cell width based on that. And if I make this a lot bigger, let's say 1080 by 1080 for the standards of an Instagram post. Let's see this with another quote and run it, and we'll see that it'll fit. I think this would be really cool if you want to send a postcard to a friend or a birthday gift to a friend. You can even make this into a poster and just print your favorite song or your favorite quote or your favorite poem, and it'll look really great and nobody actually knows what it means. You're the only one that knows it. It's also an interesting way to use generative art to generate art that actually means something. What I like about SVGs or importing SVGs into processing is that you can create whatever shapes you want and just import them and use them however you like. I remember creating a game in 2014, 2015 in processing using characters that I've created in Illustrator, and then I imported them as SVGs and used them as the 2 players in the game. I'm going to include these glyphs or these shapes that I've created in the folder of the sketch on GitHub, but I would recommend that you create your own shapes because I'd love to see what kind of shapes you come up with. You can maybe come up with different characters for each of the letters based on people you know in real life, or based on characters from your favorite movie or TV show. I think that would look really interesting. Okay, that's all I have for this tutorial, and I'll talk to you next time.